Okay, thanks for having me. The title of my presentation is Alone in Quarantine, Ethics of Khalwah in the Age of Pandemics. First, the loneliness issues. Even before the imposed quarantine due to COVID-19 pandemics, chronic loneliness, especially for older adults, was increasingly recognized as a health issue. Christine Emerson, a clinical assistant professor of gerontology at the University of Georgia College of Public Health, who investigates the impact of chronic loneliness among older adults, says, direct quote, recent studies have even suggested that loneliness is a risk factor for early death comparable to smoking or being an alcoholic, end quote. He adds, quote, people who are socially isolated might be more likely to be lonely, but married people can be lonely as well, as can people who come from very family-oriented or community-oriented cultures. Loneliness doesn't discriminate, end quote. Nearly 1 in 3 older adults are feeling lonely in the US, or put it more accurately, 37% of American citizens are self-identified as chronically lonely. Sustained loneliness has been linked to heart disease, high blood pressure, disability, cognitive decline, depression, early entry into nursing homes, and increased doctors' visits. Of course, loneliness is not new, but social awareness of the negative impacts of loneliness is rather new. According to the report of the Joe Cox Commission on Loneliness, published in December 2017, over 9 million adults in the UK are often or always lonely. 50% of disabled people will be lonely on any given day. 43% of 17 to 25 years old using Actionful Children services experience problem with loneliness. 52% of parents have had a problem with loneliness. For 3.6 million people age 65, television is the main form of company. 200,000 older people have not had conversation with a friend or relative in more than a month. 38% of people with dementia said that they had lost friends after their diagnosis. 8 out of 10 carers have felt lonely or isolated as a result of looking after a loved one. 58% of migrants and refugees in London describe loneliness and isolation as their biggest challenge. More than 1 in 3 people aged 75 and over say that feelings of loneliness are out of their control. Given this situation, in January 2018, the British Prime Minister at that time, Theresa May, announced the appointment of Minister for Loneliness to help tackle the misery endured by millions of Britons. Moreover, in October 2018, the UK government published a policy paper entitled A Connected Society, a strategy for tackling loneliness, laying the foundations for change. The paper describes itself as the world's first government strategy developed to tackle loneliness. In this paper, the loneliness was defined as, quote, a subjective, unwelcome feeling of lack or loss of companionship. It happens when we have a mismatch between the quantity and the quality of social relationships that we have and those that we want, end quote. With the wake of COVID-19 pandemics that has the large majority staying indoors, loneliness became even much more a large-scale health issue. With the appearance of COVID-19, the world changed, if not for always, at least for the foreseeable future. Crowds were no longer seen in the street, people left the shops, and they work from home. Even when going out, people usually refrain from shaking hands or giving hugs. Social distancing and self-quarantining are aimed at preventing the spread of the virus, and the need to do so is clear. But its impact on psychophysical health, specifically through chronic loneliness, is not yet so much clear. A review article published in March 2020 in Lancet on the psychological impact of quarantine reports that hospital staff who cared for or came into contact with those being quarantined was itself more predictive of acute stress disorder. Furthermore, that same study found that quarantined individuals were more likely to report symptoms of irritability, indecisiveness, poor concentration, fatigue, and exhaustion, and insomnia, consistent with the loneliness and social isolation they felt during quarantine. Another study mentioned in the Lancet article cited the fact that post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD) symptoms were reported by hospital workers 3 years after quarantine, lending credence to the belief that the loneliness and isolation can have long-lasting mental health consequences. 2. Religion and the problem of loneliness. While loneliness studies are in the early stage, the question worth asking here and now is, what role can religion play to mitigate the health damage of loneliness? To begin with, it is famous that Freud claimed in his magnum opus, The Future of an Illusion, that devout intrinsic religion buffers the threat of social isolation, rejection, and loneliness. Put it simply, when one believes that there is a loving God out there taking care of us, and when one internalizes this belief, one is usually more capable of not feeling chronic loneliness. Experimental studies confirm this. Directly intended to test Freud's hypothesis with regard to the feeling of loneliness motivates intrinsic religion, 72 undergraduates, at least moderately interested in religion, first completed 3 skills tapping different dimensions of personal religion: intrinsic, extrinsic, and quest. About a week later, each subject performed a writing task that either did or did not make vulnerability to loneliness salient, and then completed the 3 religious orientation skills again. Supporting Freud's claim, the study showed that high loneliness salience subjects reported higher scores on the intrinsic scale on the second administration, whereas low salience subjects did not. Put it simply, loneliness motivates religion, and religion alleviates loneliness. The review of data on loneliness also shows that religious attendance, especially among older people, is associated with higher levels of social integration and social support, and that social integration and social support are associated with lower level of loneliness. But Neil Cross from the Department of Health Behavior and Health Education, School of Public Health, University of Michigan, argued in 2016 that, quote, even though it makes sense to propose that greater involvement in religion may reduce loneliness, it is surprising to find that the relationship between religion and loneliness has not been examined more frequently in the literature. In fact, we were able to find only 3 studies that examined this issue empirically, end quote. 2 of these 3 we already quoted in this paper. What I would like to add to the slim literature on religion and loneliness as only a cursory suggestion is that the concept of khalwah, esoteric seclusion or retreat, might help deepen our understanding of religion and loneliness, especially in the age of global quarantine. Khalwa is defined as being with oneself, and it might not be an exaggeration to claim that this is absent from what is commonly called secular lifestyles. When you're watching a movie on Netflix, to let the time passes in quarantine, whatever pleasant it might be, all other things being equal, you are not with yourself esoterically speaking, but you are being barred from being with yourself. While in khalwa, you're alone with yourself, trying to dig deeper into your inner self. Among Muslims, khalwa is historically modeled on the Prophet's retreat in the cave of Hira for a long and consistent period. The purpose of khalwa is to detach from people, relationships, virtual or actual, habit of reliance on others in order to evaluate oneself in terms of what you do to others and to yourself, and in terms of evaluating the virtues and vices of self. One aspect of khalwa, religiously speaking, is to remember God, dhikr, and to pray to God, dua. Dua is widely taken to be an option only for believers. And that is, at least initially, makes perfect sense. If you are going to ask God for something, you have to first believe that God exists and is able out there to answer your prayers. But as an agnostic philosopher and historian of philosophy, Anthony Kenny, born in 1931, argues, an agnostic praying to God is surely no more unreasonable than the act of a man adrift in the ocean, trapped in a cave, or stranded on a mountainside, who cries for help though he may never be heard, or fires a signal which may never be seen. End quote. Put it another way, even an agnostic, and by extension, one might say, an atheist who is not sure about the non-existence of God, could have, at least under certain circumstances, could have khalwa without compromising his or her agnostic or atheistic position. This makes the religious ethics of khalwa an interesting option for the overwhelming majority of people in the age of quarantine and widespread loneliness. Thank you very much.